Hi, I'm Ethan Wong, and today I'm here talking with Crystal Wilkinson. And if you don't mind, we'll get straight into questions.
Sure, that's fine.
So something I ask basically everyone on here is, what to you is special about poetry as opposed to any other art form?
For me, it's vulnerability, I think, and beauty. I am primarily a fiction writer, even though I'm the poet laureate of the state. I had my first collection of poetry come out in August, and I've always loved poetry and loved poets, but fiction has been my primary medium. And what I find for myself is that poetry allows more vulnerability. There's something wonderful about writing fiction where I can have be playful and have my truth sort of buried underneath the fiction, and the reader never knows. But I feel much more exposed and vulnerable when I write poetry. And I think I feel the same way when I read other people's poetry.
Yeah, there's something about poetry, maybe it's the form or maybe it's the tradition. I can't quite place it, but it's very honest in the way it presents itself, because there's almost a feeling that there's not too much room for obfuscation in the first place.
Right, right. And of course, the form does that in that simply that there are less words and that it's condensed, and then you add figurative language and beauty on top of that. And I think that it really has the ability to be even more honest. There's more truth, I think, sometimes than there is in prose.
Yeah. That actually interests me though, because you say that you primarily go for fiction. So kind of what does that look like in terms of how each form of writing informs the other when you write?
Yeah, so before my novel, which was the last book that I had before Perfect Black came out. So The Birds of Opulence, when I wrote that book and it came out in 2016, it changed, something shifted in me as a writer, because I've always written poetry, but poetry's always been sort of hidden. It's what I sort of do for myself, and poems are just like in the drawer or in the computer. I've had a few poems published here and there in journals, but always sort of hid them away. But when I wrote The Birds of Opulence, it was the first time that I had let the poet, which looks at the poet in me, looks at distillation, looks at boiling things down to the essence. The poet in me looks for the beauty of language, looks for metaphorical language in other ways that the fiction writer doesn't. The fiction writer in me looks at story, the way a story is told. And the nonfiction writer, of course, looks at the truth as it pertains to it sometimes my own experience. So when I wrote The Birds of Opulence, that was the first time that I allowed all of those writers to live in one place. And I didn't worry about, plucking them out where needed. And I also didn't put the complete burden on the fiction writer. So I allowed the poet to come in. I allowed the nonfiction writer to come in. And that's kind of how I wrote this collection too. It's sort of, there are longer lyrics in this book, longer pieces that some folks would call either prose poems or flash nonfiction. And so I allowed all of those sort of writers to live in the same head, the same heart, the same body. And I think that will be sort of my voice from here on out. And I also play with form in the book. I don't write any formal poetry, but I play with form. Like there's a poem in the book that's written both as a prose piece and written in couplets. So I was thinking about, what does form do for the same story? What happens when there is a sort of storytelling voice? There's some truth in a piece that's completely close to the bone, my truth, and also poetry, sort of living in the same house. So I like that experimentation, and I think that'll be a big part of my voice moving forward.
That's really interesting to think about, just kind of combining all of those things. Because a way that I've heard a lot of people describe it before is they have to like put themselves into separate like mental spheres whenever they write one or the other. But I think the fact that you've combined them is something I have yet to hear about. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, that's a new thing for me, and I think that it's something that I'll keep throughout my writing life. This sort of hybridity. So I'm working on I have a new book coming out that's nonfiction that'll be coming out with Penguin in 2023, and I hope it works for the editors because I'm writing it the same way because it's nonfiction, but I'm also counting on, I think repetition is holy. So I'm counting on repetition. I'm working with line, I'm working with lyricism within those nonfiction pieces. So it's become sort of who I am as a writer. And then I seek out writers who are doing something similar.
Yeah. Kind of going on to a different topic now. So for all these kind of this hybrid stuff that you write, does your like, I guess I'd be asking like from before when you saw them as more separate, maybe, did your sources of inspiration for each kind of writing differ? And like, how did that change then when you started putting them together?
Well, I think they do differ, but I'm drawn to, like I was drawn to fiction writers already that use lyricism, like Toni Morrison or Michael Ondaatje, who writes in all the genres too, all three of those genres too. I was reading a lot of prose writing by poets. So, like Lucille Clifton's Generations is a memoir that she wrote. And of course, also being informed by her poetry. Ocean Vuong, who, is a fairly new writer, younger than I am, but his way of writing story, and depending on sort of juxtaposition of things that are happening to create tension versus a sort of traditional plot, all of those things interest me, and other writers who've done that. So I've looked to writers who also write poetry, fiction writers who also write poetry and write nonfiction as inspiration for a long time.
Yeah, and even adding on to that, are there any sorts of events in your own life that would inspire you to write? Like, do you ever find yourself looking at these events and you find that you can kind of categorize them?
You mean into one genre, or?
Not into like a genre of writing per se, but just that a lot of what you write about from your own life tends to be this kind of topic, or tends to be like this kind of theme.
Maybe, I have, what's been new for me is to write about my own like childhood sexual trauma, which I had never written about head on. But when I go back and I look, my first book came out in 2000. So when I go back and I look at that collection of short stories, which were vignettes, so I was already playing with form a little bit because they weren't longer stories. Some of the stories are only 2 or 3 pages long. If I look at all of those works and the individual short stories that I've had published in individual essays, there are themes that come through. Sort of my struggle with religion, of growing up in the church and then sort of moving away from the church is a theme that comes through. The rural landscape and what the rural landscape bears for particularly Black women has been something that I've written about. And I can't say that, 20 years ago when I first started publishing, I can't say that I was readily saying, I'm going to explore these themes. They just seem to be the themes that have haunted me throughout my writing life so far. And even when I don't recognize them as being there, when I go back and I look, if I'm reading for theme, I say, oh, okay, there they are. And this sort of thing about ancestral heritage is something else that I write about. How much of who we are is brought from the past, and is it from the recent past to our parents, or does it go back even further? Like, how much have we brought forward? How much have we left behind? How much will we continue on into the future? I'm really interested in that too, sort of the African concept of Sankofa.
Yeah. I think what it comes to is that if you write a lot, you're not really thinking about what exactly you're writing about, it's because it just naturally comes out that you write about those things that, like you said, kind of haunt you throughout. And then yeah, it really does take that kind of retrospection to be like, oh, so yeah, I do write a lot about that, or I do end up thinking a lot about that, which is why I write a lot about that. And so I think that also comes from a place of just there's a lot of genuine heart in the way you write about those kinds of things. And I think that's why the poetry or the writing or the fiction or whatever that you write about it comes off much better, just because of how genuine you are when you write about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's, it comes from a place that's not, always, when I'm teaching, I always tell my students that, sometimes you'll get these sort of well-formed poems or well-formed stories that have perfect structure, but they feel like they've been written from the head. Like the student has said, I'm going to write a story that has perfect characters. It has a perfect, it's linear. It has a perfect beginning, middle, and end. It has rising action. It has falling action. It has denouement. But it's not from the gut or the heart. They're not really interested in what's happening in the story. And I have students who write poems the same way. And it's like, oh, it's a very well-crafted sonnet, or it's a very well-crafted poem where you've paid attention to all of these structural elements. But is this something that you really felt in the gut and the heart? So I think that paying attention, even if sometimes they're painful, paying attention to what haunts you is equally as important. I think it's also important to write those things so you can sort of write them out, because I think that some writers write about those same things throughout their whole careers. And then I think that if you ignore them, they're still there in your subconscious saying, hello, you're thinking about me, so you should be writing about me. But I think there is something about writing them out so that you can move on to the next thing.
Yeah, and even just writing them out, I found, can be something, just a cathartic experience for yourself, because there is something to it, which is before you put into a poem a lot of these kinds of emotions, the reason why you'd want to write a poem about this emotion is because you can't really sum it up in like 2 words and tell the other people like, here's what I'm feeling. So you write a poem because you're like, well, this is the best way I know, the closest I can get to describing it. And by doing that, you kind of put a name to it, and then it becomes easier to comprehend and kind of easier to deal with sometimes. So
right.
And what you said earlier about how it doesn't come from the gut or the heart, I thought that was interesting, because it brought up something else I've been thinking about, which is kind of this ineffable quality of poetry, which is like, you always feel like a poem can be very well crafted, like you said, but there might just be some little thing missing. And so whenever you write your work, how do you kind of deal with that popping up? Does it pop up? What do you think about that?
I mean, I think it pops up. It's certainly popping up in the writing that I'm doing now, because I feel sort of an urgency by outside sources to get it done. And I'm like, oh, well, it's the same thing. I'm like, well, the writing's okay, but there's not that other level of heart in it. So I have to sort of begin again, which is not what my editor wants me to do, but I sort of begin again. So, because it has to have some of that for me before I can move forward. So it becomes sort of a writer's block for me, especially if I'm sort of publishing makes you write in sort of an unnatural way, because before I started publishing and there was the book that had to be, that had a deadline to be turned in, I would often start writing about what was in my head or on my heart or in my gut. And I never knew whether it was going to be a poem or a short story or an essay. And I kind of felt that freedom. And it's a freedom that, along with all the wonderful things about being published, it's a freedom that I sort of miss. That's sort of the play of making art. And then, having this lump of clay that's made of this subject that you're writing about, and then you coming back in and sort of chiseling it into a work of art, be it a poem, an essay, or a story. So I don't feel like I have that. In one way, of course, it's a privilege to be published, and in another way, I think it's a privilege not to be. It's when you can be more creative and be more expressive with what you're writing, and sort of be all over the place, which was the kind of artist I was before I started being published.
And one last question before we go into a poem reading, kind of branching off of what you said about being published. You mentioned kind of this freedom of not being published. And with it, I think, comes this idea that when you're not necessarily thinking about published, you're just like writing whatever you want to write. But as to when you actually think, okay, well, maybe I want to get published now, did you feel like your mindset changed, like from the very first time you were looking to get published? And then how did you kind of deal with that as you had to maybe write works to get published instead of just for yourself?
Yeah, I don't think it changed. I mean, I think that what I'm referring to is the project, whatever the project is, but I don't think the individual, what I want to write about changed, because I've turned a lot of things down, opportunities to publish because of drastic changes that an editor wanted to make. For example, my last book is very familial. It's like all generations going back. And I had an editor who said, well, I think you should just focus on these two girls. If you make it more like women's lit or chick lit, they were calling it at the time, then I think we could really sell a lot of. So why don't you get rid of the grandmother and the great grandmother and all these ancestors? And I was just like, what? No, I can't do that. And so I was willing to go with a smaller press, because I felt like that was the particular story that book needed to tell. On the other hand, I'm certainly not arrogant. I know that editors are there to help you and to make the work better, and I love that part. But I also felt like I had to stay true to the original impetus for the writing.
Yeah, I think that's something good to keep in mind, because I feel there's almost this pressure that at some point you need to cater your writing to publishing, but from what I hear, that's probably a pitfall. So
yeah, and I see a lot of poets that I love. I won't name any of them, but poets that I've loved, and I love their first book because they wrote that way. And then it's kind of like by their third book, you see this sort of shift toward a sort of poetics that's going to be more acceptable to the masses. And I'm like, oh, but I loved that first book when they were doing something a little bit more wild, a little bit more unique, before they, the pendulum sort of swings and they begin to do other things. So I'm hoping, I think publishing is changing, so I'm hoping for more and more freedom in the way that poets can write. There's room for all kinds of poems now, in ways that there wasn't even a decade ago.
yeah, definitely. It's always feels like probably the fastest growing genre in some ways.
It is, yeah.
So if you're ready, we can get into the poem reading.
Sure. I'm going to read a poem from my new collection, Perfect Black. And my mother, I grew up with my mother having schizophrenia. And so my mother's absence is something that I always sort of wrote about. And I also grew up in a rural area. So one of the things that always happened being raised by my grandparents is that I would come home and there would be something dead in the middle of the kitchen. And in this instance, in this poem, it's a hog's head. Like I would come home from school and there'd be like a whole hog's head in a galvanized tub. And even then, as a child, I was thinking about these things, but sort of always parallel was my mother's absence when she was in a mental institution. So this is called Asking About My Mother. In the small kitchen, the hog's head weaves the gamey scent of death throughout the house. My grandmother scrapes black hair from the hog's pink head with the sharp blade of her butcher knife. I ask her about my mother. I always ask her about my mother. I play paper dolls under a formica table with pearls around my neck and pink lipstick from my mother's treasure chest. My grandmother places the head into the tub and I watch her hands, wait for her to tell me where my mother's gone. My grandmother fills the tub with water. I hate that she always reminds me of all she's done for love. Remember, remember, hair, face, knife. She lifts the heavy tub and situates the hog upon the stove, covering all the burners and turns on all the eyes.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here today.
Yes, I certainly love talking to you. I'm glad we worked it out.
Yeah, thank you.